to the briefing you guys just got, the actual name of the session is The More Sophisticated Understanding of BP. Whereas subsequent training sessions will cover more depth on how to build cases and construct arguments and do analysis, won't they, Keith? This is going to be focused very much on the features of British parliamentary and how to exploit them. Yes. So this session's probably going to be about half me giving you tips on what to do and half me telling you stories from my own debating career to put them in context. Those are like the three main areas that we're going to try and cover. I will probably rant for hours nonsensically if you don't ask me questions at some point. I do bite, but I bite when I sense weakness, so asking questions is probably a good way to avoid that. Bully me, force me to give up the answers, but please bully only me and be respectful to other people when they're asking questions. But before we get into this session, does anyone have any residual questions from last week, either about rules of BP or about the exhibition debate? Yep.
Just position of wit and how to not sound so repetitive and hiding and just being passionate debating and going away, which is what I always do.
All right. Well, we might save that for position-specific notes. Flag that up again when we get to it. Anyone else? Anyone unclear of the rules of BP? No? All right. So we're also going to use a couple of motions just as specific examples, so you might want to photograph them or take them down. Is anyone unclear of the actual words in those topics or doesn't understand what the debates are asking? No? All right. Well, for those who don't know, a private military contractor is literally a for-profit private military that gets contracted to do mercenary work. Sometimes they're hired by the US, sometimes they're hired by corporations. You literally pay the soldiers to do what you want, basically. Shall we move on? Yep. All right, so let's start with just some quick stuff on the new features and how to do them moderately well to really well. POIs. When you're offering a POI, there's a very strong urge, especially when you get started, to just sort of rebut the thing that was immediately said beforehand by the speaker. Resist that urge. Those POIs always end up being terrible, and they're probably the worst possible use of about the only opportunity you'll get to ask that speaker a question. So don't just take the thing they said, no matter how tempted you are, and try to rebut it in 15 seconds. What you should be doing is writing them down and planning them out. Especially if you're in the opening half and the debates move to the closing half, the POIs are all you have, and you should be writing them down in detail so that both people can critique them and make sure that they are the best possible thing they can be. And when you're doing that, actually think about how you would answer them. A lot of POIs sound great in your head, but then when you actually think about how to answer them, they end up coming out really badly. So to use an example from last year's Pro-Am Grand Final, the motion was that we should use pornography as a tool in sex education classes. At Opening Gov, the first POI that we took from closing op went, would you be okay with the teacher hiring two people to come in and have sex in front of the children in the classroom? How would you answer that? How many people for yes? How many people for no? Okay, about a 50-50 split. As it went, the answer I actually gave was, so long as they have working with children checks, yes, we're okay with that happening. or words to that effect. And the response on closing op's face told me that they had clearly not been expecting that. And they hadn't really thought about how they were going to exploit that POI if I'd said yes. And as it turns out, that shut down a lot of response for them. So this applies to when you're taking POIs as well as when you're giving them. Think for a second. You don't have to jump on it right away. You can stop, take a moment, and think about how you want to answer it. Because very often a POI that sounds really brilliant is actually really easy to answer if you haven't given it that little bit of extra thought. And you probably also shouldn't ask a POI if you don't know how that person is going to answer it. The exception being if you think you've got a POI that you think just can't be answered without screwing the person. Yes? Sorry, I can't quite hear you. As in, do you learn via experience? Well, you do, but even before that, just like letting your partner look at the POI you're about to ask and having him or her critique it will probably go a long way to getting you better POIs. It also forces you to think about it a bit more clearly when you write them down. That last little bit about offering the POI when you expect to be taken is just like good sense. If the speaker's been going for about 2 minutes and is clearly coming to the end of the argument, they're much more likely to take you if you ask at that point. Whereas if you jump straight up as soon as the 1 minute mark is reached, there's pretty much a 0% chance of getting taken. When you're accepting them, the image is cut off. All right. So a big problem a lot of novice speakers when they first get into BP have is that they always say, no thank you, or they always take the longest pause possible when rejecting a POI. Ideally what you should be doing is to just continue speaking at a consistent pace, barely pay any attention to the person who's offered a POI, and just wave them down. You also shouldn't take them when you're in the middle of an argument. You should save them for like the break between points of rebuttal or between substantive points. Something you'll learn later on is that it's usually better to prioritise the stronger opposition team if one of them has emerged in the debate so far, because judges reward you for engaging with the teams that are more difficult to engage with. Obviously you should, as a team, take each other side at least once, but if you're going to take 3 or 4 POIs across you, prioritise the stronger team. And then the final thing to say is that like a lot of POIs go, oh, I'll get to that later on, or I'm going to answer that later. Even if that's the case, give some sort of immediate response, even just a brief summary of what your later point is going to be, because it's really irritating to adjudicators when you don't actually answer the POI. And the drawback is that a lot of people often never get to answer that POI when they say that in a speech. They were going to get to it like 2 minutes down the line, and then they run out of speaker time or they forget to do it. So give some sort of response, either the full response or just a outline of how you're going to do it later. Anyone like got any basic questions about POIs? No? Oh, yeah.
On the point of offer them when you expect to be taken, isn't there also another school of thought that just says that offering POIs is merely a way of showing the adjudicator that you are engaged, even if you do it at the 1 minute mark?
Oh, so like, obviously don't offer only when you expect to be taken, but when there's like 20, 30-second pauses between offerings, try and tailor them to the gaps in the person's speech where they're most likely to take them. Does that make sense? Yep? Okay. As for the kinds of POIs you ask, like most of them are pretty debate specific, but if you just want some like general things that are good to try and aim at, the first one is to point out like a contradiction or a tension in the other side's case. And very often these occur when like the affirmative side has asserted that an actor is going to change dramatically just because of their proposal. So right now, bankers are evil corporate overlords trying to milk as much cash as they can out of their clients. But if we prevent them from like owning television networks, suddenly they'll be really good to their consumers. And a great way of exploiting massive character shifts in a case is to just literally ask the person, well, why is this change happening? Isn't that a double standard? Or similarly, you can illustrate like a failure of logic. So point out that the thing that the other side has proposed isn't actually going to fulfill what they've set it out, or point that they haven't filled out their analysis. The point is that there's like a lot of logical ways you can use a POI to exploit opposition cases. The one caveat I'll say is don't literally just ask them to improve their own case. What I mean by that is like if you've given them a POI which says, can you explain that? Or would you be able to tell us this? Because they can usually just actually answer that question and you've just helped them make their own argument stronger. It's a lot better if during your speech you bring that up in rebuttal and exploit the fact that they haven't actually spelt that out. Stephen, are you stretching or asking a question?
Would you ever use a POI to point out a knife? So in terms of, you can have a contradiction or a tension within a case, but you also have a contradiction or a tension between a
Well, we'll get to knifing later.
So just to explain to everyone in the room, a knife is when the opening sets up one case and then the closing sets up something that's totally inconsistent. So you understand the question?
Yeah. Well, we'll get to knifing later, but it would depend like how significant the knife was. I'll talk about that more when we get to knifing. Anyone got like questions about those, about POIs at all? Yep.
Would you advise even taking a POI at the 1 minute mark, like if you're fine, just because you think they might have one? Or do you know
Take a POI when you think the other side doesn't have one?
You know how some people just stand up at the 1 minute mark just to give a POI because it's like they can give a POI now, but they probably don't actually want the question prepared.
So you want to take the POI when you think they haven't got one prepared. I would advise against ever doing that because you can't really be certain they don't have a POI. Unless you were going to take it anyway, I wouldn't recommend doing that because best case scenario they just try and improvise one right there on the spot, and worst case scenario they do actually have one, and at 1 minute you're not prepared to answer it. You don't really gain much from demonstrating like unpreparedness in the other team because they will have their own speeches and they will have POIs later. I think it's probably not worth the trade-off. Any other questions? Yep.
In the last 4 points, as a trade, we actually have to use all of those points to successfully answer the question.
You use whichever one like makes the most sense in the context of the debate, and that really is just a matter of like case by case experience and getting better at it. But these are just some like good classic POIs you can use, and sometimes there will be POIs that are not on this list and make far more sense. I can't tell you what those are because I won't be doing all the debates that you'll be doing. Yep.
Bad to ask for POI when giving a speech, even if nobody's standing up when you're breaking the speech.
If like it's a reasonable point into your speech, like the 3 or 4 minute mark, and they have either not been offering or that's when you're ready to take, yeah, you don't lose anything really from asking for a POI. One thing I see some people do that I really would advise against is asking for a POI from a specific team that's avoiding offering you one when the other side has been really enthusiastic about giving them to you. So for the first 5 minutes of your speech, opening op has been jumping up really frequently offering you POIs, and CO has demonstrated a complete unwillingness to offer. I wouldn't go asking for one from them specifically. I also wouldn't ever at any point during your speech say explicitly, I'm not taking a POI from that team anymore. Which, don't laugh, some people do it, and it's a really terrible thing in your speech. Yep.
When you talk about choosing to take one from the team, in the situation where the team that's really enthusiastic have already taken, say, 2 from them as a team, would you say that you would then request that the other team not so seeking
It would depend how many they've been offering up to that point. If they've literally offered you none, don't do it. If they have and they just weren't ready at that moment, then go for it. But generally a failure to offer POIs is their problem, not yours. Any other questions? Yep.
So when you say that you should give them an opportunity to improve their own case, how would you phrase the question like, can you explain this, or why is this the case, without phrasing it so that they're just going to say yes, or like, oh, that's really simple. Does that make sense?
Well, I probably wouldn't, if I'm literally just asking them to explain a loophole in their analysis, I probably wouldn't ask it at all. I would probably just exploit in my rebuttal that they didn't actually prove that. If it's a point of clarification, like you literally don't understand the model, then go ahead and ask that, but only if it's like a minute into the speech and it's actually a definitional problem, not an argument problem. Yeah?
What's laying a trap?
Laying a trap is where you like ask for an expansion of the model or just like some sort of clarification that gives you new material later on in the debate. So last year we did a debate about abolishing paroles, and we asked the opening government, would you allow sentences to be, opening government set out a case for definite sentences, definite length of sentences. So we asked them if they'd be willing to extend a sentence by a certain point if the criminal was badly behaved. And when they answered no, that gave us something else we could run at closing opposition. So it's just like, it's tricky to do them because very often your opening will figure out what you're doing. But if they're like really subtle, you can create new material in the debate just by getting them to answer a question wrong. Yep. Shall we move on? Just for a bit of fun, this is like a video from a world semi-final, and it's just sort of literally the reaction you're hoping for when you ask a POI. The topic is about restricting all images that contain any intent to produce sexual arousal to XXX domains. Apparently the video player doesn't work, which is unfortunate. Stupid Monash software. Sorry? Okay. I'll try a narration. So the POI was, so this is the opposition leader speaking, and he's laid out a case for how important sexuality in public is to provoke a discussion. And so the POI coming from Kieran was, do you support people having sex in public? And there's about a 20-second pause while he stutters and thinks about what his answer is going to be. So that's the reaction you're hoping for when you ask a POI. You want someone to literally sacrifice 30 seconds of their speech because they haven't been able to answer the question. Well, Sasha's etiquette rules are like something I can't teach you, so... Yeah.
Is it safe to just kind of go with the thing when you say yes, something that sounds a bit ridiculous, when like, yeah, we're happy for that to happen. Like, what's generally...
If you're receiving the POI?
Yeah.
Well, you should think about what the thing is and how crazy it is to say yes. So using that pro-am example from last year, it's something that intuitively sounds really ridiculous, but I thought to myself, since we're already showing pornography in the classrooms, the only real difference with having two people in there is like the ability to answer questions while they're doing it. We're not really exposing the children to that much more, are we, by allowing this? Whereas it's a huge contradiction to say we're okay with videotaping people having sex, but we're not really that okay with them doing it live. Yep.
What do you think Ben should have said?
There is a difference between pornography in public and like mildly sexually arousing images. I don't think it's really that tough a POI to answer, but it was just sort of in there for fun. Yep.
I think Steve said something good last week, which is if you truly have no idea what the POI is, potentially just either saying yes or no isn't a terrible way to go.
This is like, that's if you don't understand the POI. This is if you like don't understand the purpose of the POI. Well, that's Stephen's approach to debating. I'll let you make up your own mind about that. All right, extensions. These are the bit that are like usually a little bit tricky for people to grapple with at first. So, most extensions fit into one of two categories. And one of the first things you should do as a closing team in prep time is figure out which is more likely to be the case for this debate. Either the debate is like really, really narrow, and you and your opening half are basically going to be arguing the same thing, and you're just going to have some sort of development that makes it better, or the debate's really, really broad, and your extension is literally going to be something totally different that drags the debate into a new focus. So, looking at those motions I gave you as case studies at the beginning, which one of those categories do you think that the advertising motion falls into? Do we think it's a really broad motion or a really narrow motion? We've got one for narrow, we've got one for broad. Show of hands for narrow? Show of hands for broad? Yeah, I think it's a really broad motion too. And usually a good question you can ask to figure out the difference is, how many reasons can we think of for doing this thing? And when it comes to banning advertising, you could want to do it because you think it like perpetuates negative stereotypes. You could do it because you think it's bad for capitalism because it encourages consumerism. You could do it because you think it creates creates problems like anorexia and body image control. There's a bunch of different reasons you could want to ban it, right? Which means that there's going to be enough arguments that the opening half can't possibly take them all in their case. And that gives you at closing the room to sort of pick a new one and drag the debate into an area your opening didn't explore. What about the PMC motion? Who's for broad? Who's for narrow? Yeah, that wasn't too hard, was it? But there's only really one reason why you want to abolish the use of PMCs, right? You think that they are untrustworthy and they kill more people. So in that debate, you could maybe want to ban them because you don't think they wear nice enough uniforms. But really, there's only one sensible reason for abolishing them. And in that kind of debate, there's no escaping the fact that you and your opening are going to have really similar sounding cases. And your extension is like a thing or maybe two things that improve upon what your opening had, but you still have the same goal, you're still executing it in the same way, you're very much a cooperative gov bench. So those kinds of debates are a little bit more difficult to find your extension in. Let's look at some of the places you can find them. The first one is like obviously a new argument. And if your openings miss the main point of the case, obviously it's really easy to win with this kind of extension, right? So I won't spend any time discussing that. The one caveat I'll say is you should really only run a new argument as your extension if it's actually an important argument. You don't want to be the team saying, let's legalize prostitution because we can tax it. No, don't laugh. There are a lot of teams who think, you know, just because our opening hasn't said anything about this, we will run it as our extension. Think about whether it's actually meaningful enough to win the debate on its own. The second sort of place you can look for material is the other side of an argument your opening took, because they only have like a collective 15 minutes. I'd be surprised if they can fully flush out all of their arguments. And to go back to that example of paroles from last year, opening opposition ran the argument that the prospect of parole gives criminals an incentive to like behave well so that they'll get released. And they literally ended the argument there. So one of the things we did at closing was ask, well, what happens instead when they've got a definite sentence length? They join gangs, they basically try to survive in prison, but they have no incentive to properly rehabilitate themselves. And then we did the comparison of those two things. And it's amazing how many times you can reuse an opening argument by just asking what happens instead and then exploring that. The third place you can kind of look is deeper analysis of an openings material, which is slightly different. This is where they've kind of given the adjudicator the idea of something, but they haven't really proven it conclusively. Most often this happens when like the opening half of the debate has resulted in like inconclusive clashes. And the easiest way to try and deepen that opening is to combine it with the opposition case and then try to win that. Yeah.
In terms of structuring that, then, like, how would you say my substantive is essentially what was worded first, but someone got the issue?
So you would figure out what the new contribution you're going to make on that argument is, and then add something to it. So using the advertising motion as an example, I think a lot of times the opening half of that debate will be the opening gov saying advertising forces people to be consumerist versus the opposition saying no, it doesn't. And there's not really a lot of analysis about that. So you at closing can sort of explain and argue as your extension that the fact that people are brought up from childhood being exposed and saturated to commercial images means that they don't understand how to ignore them because that's been the norm for so long, it's all they know. And that would be how you deepen the existing analysis your opening gave. Does that make sense to people? Do they know what I mean by that? Obviously, deeper analysis is pretty motion specific, but do they understand what I mean by improving upon an opening argument? Yep. But make sure you give the adjudicator a really clear explanation as to what you're adding is the most important thing there. Yep. Well, it'll depend on the debate in specific, but I think the best extensions are the ones that come before rebuttal, or where the extensions themselves are the rebuttal, because it's demonstrating that that thing you're adding is like right at the centre of the debate and is really important. I was actually going to talk about that a bit later. But I think that's a very good point. If your extension is dealing with like the most significant bit of the opposition case, I think having it front and centre at the start of your speech is a really good thing to do in the member. Yeah. So new rebuttal is the last place you can look for an extension. And some judges accept new rebuttal as an extension, some don't. They really all should. But if you take that rebuttal and frame it as a substantive point, there is no disputing that it constitutes a valid extension. So the way you do that is to figure out the reason you're challenging the other side's argument and make that your extension. So looking at the PMC debate, op case is essentially going to be, we can trust the PMCs because the prospect of future employment forces them to behave themselves, otherwise we'll go to their competitors instead. Do people understand that line of argumentation? Yeah. So at closing gov, you could, for instance, rebut that by saying that that market for healthy competition doesn't exist because there's only a very small number of PMCs. And you see how that's now sounding like its own substantive point, even though it's rebuttal to that side's case. So the trick is to actually figure out a reason, and there's usually a reason why the other side's argument isn't true, and make it sound like a substantive argument or a new extension. It's okay to, it's perfectly okay to say, like, this deals with the thing that we got from opening opposition when you're making your extension. But since some judges don't like rebuttal as an extension, it's useful to be able to frame it in a substantive light. And particularly if your opening's taken literally everything else, that's an important skill to have. Any questions about extensions? No? Cool. Subtle knifing. Do people know what knifing is? Did Elder cover it last week? Yeah. Sorry? No. Okay. So explicit knifing is not allowed and you will be punishment for it. But sometimes it's really tempting to knife, especially when your opponent runs something totally, when your opening runs something totally stupid and you don't think you can build on it. That's Muck and he's pointing up. So what do you do in that situation? Your opening has totally screwed up the motion by like getting you to defend slavery, and you really don't want to, and you really want to be able to knife in that case. The first thing to figure out is if it's legitimate to do it. And the questions you need to ask are, did the opening do something which has just made the debate inviolable, or is it just something we have a preference that they didn't? So if the debate is about having an inheritance tax, and your opening sets it as a 100% inheritance tax, that's probably not legitimate for you to knife, because it's still within the boundaries of the definition. If, on the other hand, they ran, we would ban advertising, as we would ban advertising except on TVs, in magazines, and on billboards, you're probably okay to knife that definition, because they've just, like, run away from the debate. They basically said, we'll only ban advertising on the internet. So you have to figure out whether they ran the spirit of the motion or not. And if they didn't, most adjudicators should agree that it's okay for you to knife them as long as you do it the right way. The other thing to say is that it's only really worth knifing if the opposition's made it a big issue in the debate, like they've constantly attacked your opening for putting this thing in their definition. If it was just like a one-liner that hasn't come up in the debate and you just don't like it, it's probably better to just let it die in the opening rather than try to bring it up again at extension. So how do you subtly knife? If it wasn't part of the model and it was just sort of implied that that would happen because of the model, you are perfectly fine to have a different version of events. You can say that, yeah, that's one possible thing, but we think this other thing is much more likely to happen because people like puppies, or whatever the analysis that supports that reasoning is. If it was part of the model, and this is where like some teams get it really, really wrong, the best you can do is try and say, well, it wasn't an important part of the model, we want to do this instead, and the judge should make some sort of assessment. And good judges shouldn't penalise you if your opening screwed you over. So we had one debate a couple of years ago that atheists should organise. And our opening said it as atheists should start their own religion, which, if you know what an atheist is not the thing you want to defend. So what we did at closing was say, well, we're essentially willing to defend the institution that resembles a religion, but we're clearly talking about like a hierarchy that's elected, that has accountability to its followers. We're not talking about a religious organisation necessarily. Do people understand like the difference between explicitly knifing and just not screwing up the debate? Yeah? Any questions on that? Cool. Let's get into some slightly more tricky stuff. Power dynamics. This is new for everyone, including me. Basically, you can have BP debates in which all four teams are really even and it's a really close debate all round, but almost every debate isn't like that. They usually have 1, 2, 3 teams that are clearly dominating the debate and shutting other teams out. And the trick to winning the debate is to be in that clash and to win it. And the trick to coming last in a debate is to not be in that clash. Because if the clash is between, say, opening gov and closing opposition, then opening op is just going to get excluded from that debate because they can't do anything to add to that once their speeches are over. And even if closing gov isn't really in that clash either, they'll still get it, they won't be as excluded from the debate as easy because they get to speak right up until the second last speech. This is Homer. That's what we call falling out of a debate, where your material just sort of gets dropped and no one engages with it, and as soon as your speeches are done, the judge never gets really to hear about your case again. That's something you definitely don't want to do. It can happen to closing teams too, Obviously, they don't really fall out of the debate because they get to speak right up until the last two speeches, but they can like really fail to insert themselves into the debate properly, and the judge just won't be that interested, and that'll result in like closing op engaging really heavily with opening gov and just giving one response to closing gov because their extension wasn't very good. So you want to try and so you need to learn to notice where most of the debate is happening and respond to it. And this is like something which isn't explicitly taught about BP, but you learn after doing it after doing a few practice debates and a few tournaments. So the reason it's important is because in a 3-on-3 debate, basically you just have to beat the other side. And it doesn't really matter how you do that, by pointing out how terrible their arguments are, by making your own really good, even better arguments. But in a BP debate, it's very different, because if you're in the opening half and you absolutely murder the other side, that still doesn't guarantee you the win, because the other two teams could come and take away first and second and leave you with third. So let's look at like some examples of how that manifests. So for instance, if opening gov really sucks in a debate and opening opposition slaughters them, and opening gov has said something like really stupid that's really easy for opening op to pick apart, you could just sit there and make point after point of rebuttal that tears that opening gov team apart. But if you do that, it's time taken away from making your own substantive case. And because of that, there's a much higher chance of you getting left out of the closing half of the debate because you haven't made your own meaningful contribution. You've just sort of pushed opening gov further out of it. So if you do that, you're pretty much guaranteed the third in that debate. What you really want to do is do the minimum amount necessary to beat opening gov, and then spend as much time as possible making your own case really strong and really important so that the other teams can't ignore you. Do people understand why, and do people understand what I'm talking about? Yeah? I'm getting no nods, no shaking. Yep? Okay. And then the flip side is like in the closing half. Say opening op does really, really badly, and closing gov is deciding how to allocate its time. Opening gov's probably already won the opening half of the debate. Closing gov could pile on and just keep rebutting opening op, but if we're pretty sure opening op has lost the debate at that point, there's not really a lot of value to that. You'll beat them and only them, and then the best part of the debate will be CO and opening gov engaging with one another. So what you're trying to do is take the debate away from your own opening half and make it really focused on the closing half, so that when the judge is making the decision, in their mind they're going, okay, first and second was probably closing op and closing gov. In summary, basically what you need to do in BP that you don't have to do in 3-on-3 is constantly be aware of who is winning the debate, which issues are more important amongst all the teams, and not just the team you're immediately engaging with. So you want to try and spend as much time building your own case and responding to the strong teams, because that's how you get into the first and second positions in a debate. And you don't want to rebut the crap team and then be left with the third position. Does that make sense? Yep. Any questions about like how you recognize that or how you do that? No? Okay. Position-specific stuff. All right, opening government. Almost all bad opening government performances come down to people panicking and not using prep time very effective. The rush is sort of, oh my god, we've only got 15 minutes. What do the words in the motion mean? Can we think of any argument that even remotely relates to it? It's actually not as stressful as people make it out to be. Even when you were doing 3-on-3 and you had half an hour prep time, I'd be very surprised if you were using all 30 minutes of it constructively. And so the trick to cutting down the stress in opening gov is to like skip over the stupid panicking and get to doing the case really effectively. There's a couple of reasons why you shouldn't panic when you're in opening gov. It's like a really formulaic position. You are the only team that literally can run its first speech without knowing what the other teams are going to do, and that gives you the most control in the debate. You also don't have to like rebut other teams barring the first opposition speaker, so you have a lot more security and control over the debate than the other teams, and you should like use that to keep you from panicking. Figure out how you want to have the debate and set it up. Don't panic and fret and spend the first 10 minutes of prep time going, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. If you're someone who like can't really help from doing that, there's another little trick I have, which is to privately celebrate every time you do something well during prep time. So every time you do something properly or constructively in prep time, just celebrate the fact that you've made life that much more difficult for your closing half. It's like, oh, well, the definition is this, yay, we win. Or we made it that much harder, we got the definition correct. Oh, this is a really good argument. Now our closing can't do that, yay. And that relieves a lot of the stress, I find, especially when the debates aren't that competitive. Just sort of thinking, yes, this is good, we are doing good stuff, this is making prep time very productive. Because it's a momentum thing. If you use the first 5 minutes of prep time really effectively, the remaining 10 will go really well as well. So that's like the biggest thing in opening government. Don't freak out about the fact that you're going to be finished after 3 speeches. And your main goal is to remain important for the debate. Like, it's the burden on having the best analysis is probably lowest for the opening gov. What the judge is really looking for them is set up a clear debate and make yourself important in it. It's going to be very difficult for you to ever actually beat closing opposition's arguments because they're 25 minutes after your case is done and all you get is like 1, maybe 2 PIs to take a swing at them. So really your goal is to try and make yourself so important that when closing up gets up to speak, they have to address your case. And so long as they can't totally shred it, you should come at least second, if not first, in that debate. So the main reason that opening gov teams usually fail at doing that is because they've tried to screw their closing half by going, there's 6 or 7 reasons why we want to do this, let's run all of them at opening gov, right? And they've spent a minute on each argument they could possibly think of. It's much better to have like a really clear problem-focused opening gov case, which says, here is a problem that we identified, we're going to solve it by doing this, and it's not going to destroy the world. And that means that when either opening or closing op get up, they either have to prove that you don't have a problem, that your solution won't work, or that it will destroy the world. And often it's really, really difficult to conclusively prove all of those things, or any of those things, especially the third one. So the big piece of advice to take away from this is don't run an argument just because it's a reason to affirm the motion and you've thought of it in 15 minutes. Use your time effectively and come up with a strong problem-focused case that the other teams can't ignore. And that's what I call the spray paint case, where you've just said, we should do this thing because we can afford it, because it's marginally good, because it will make people feel better, and because it looks good on our resume. Pick one of those things, probably the second one. Do people get what I mean by focus your case effectively from opening gov? Yep. Any questions about opening gov? Yep. Narrow within the spirit of the motion. So don't add a whole lot of layers to your model that are just totally unnecessary, and don't box out arguments just because you can. Usually if the arguments aren't part of your main clash, then it's good for your closing to take them because they're less important. So sometimes that's a great way to win, is to leave really bad arguments for the closing to take. Okay, you've still got it at least. Is to leave really bad arguments for the closing to take so that their extension ends up being not very good. I have no idea what I'm looking at anymore. Okay, opening opposition. So the main reason I see opening opposition teams lose is because they get bogged down in these stupid layers of opposition. They question whether or not the model will work, or they question whether or not there's a similar thing that you could also do. So why are you setting quotas for women but not for Indigenous people in parliament? The biggest thing in opening opposition is to avoid those crappy lines of opposition. You need to find an actual reason why the motion is a bad idea or has a substantial harm, and you need to take that away from your closing half. Because if you spend the whole first speech or half the first speech on the bad lines of opposition that are just like cheap shots that question the efficacy of it, you're almost guaranteed to get boxed out in the closing half of the debate. So skip over stuff which the opening obviously doesn't have to prove in order to win the debate, and go for the more substantial harm, because otherwise closing opposition gets to take that, gets to run it as their extension, and gets to just brutally dominate the debate with it. The second thing to say about why opening opposition teams often lose is they aren't very assertive into the debate. They sort of take opening gov's case and go, that problem won't occur, their characterization is wrong, here's a reason why it's bad. the best opening opposition teams start the debate by kind of framing, forget about opening gov for the moment, we have our own problem, we have a solution, and now they're going to get in the way of it. And they sort of construct their own substantive case so significantly that the closing half almost views them as the ones that set up the debate instead of opening gov. Does that make sense to people? So they're not just debating in opening gov's world, they're trying to set up their own world and they're trying to make their own substantive case so big that it can't be ignored by the other people. And very often opening gov will just sort of be forgotten if opening op does that really, really well, because they only get one speech to respond to it and then you get another speech after that. And if they can't destroy your world in 7 minutes, then it has to enter into the closing half of the debate. So the question to be asking yourselves when you're prepping opening op is not, what are opening government going to run? How do we respond to it? It's sort of, what do we want to run? What do we want the debate to be about? And to form a substantive case that actually defends that. And you see a lot of opening op, like, a lot of people don't like being in opening gov, but for my money, I think opening op is probably the hardest position to win a debate from. And the big trick to doing it is to take control of the debate and never lose it. Does that make sense? Any questions about the opening half positions? No? At all? Okay. The thing that's relevant to both opening teams, obviously, is POIs, and they basically become the only thing you have once your speeches are done, your only way of remaining relevant in the debate. As much as possible, you should be trying to use your POIs in the closing half to bring your own material back. The first thing to look for is, do you need to reconstruct part of it because a closing team has rebutted it? If you do, try and figure out like a 15-second way of responding to that and rebuilding your material. And if you get the time, I would recommend looking up Beavis's World semi-final. Him and Nita use a couple of POIs to do that pretty well. The other thing you want to do is, if your material is still fine, you just want to kind of keep it relevant in the debate so that the other teams can't run away from it. Literally try and link it to something the closing opposition has been talking about, or the closing government, and explain why it's relevant and force them to deal with it. You can, if you wish, just try to like torpedo the closing team's case. But really you should only do that if you think your own case is still strong enough to beat it. The main thing you want to do with your POIs at opening is use them to bring your material back and relevant. And try to improve on it a little bit as well. So once you've sat down and both of you have finished your speeches, it's literally just the two of you toying with the words in your motion, in your POI, for the rest of the debate, right? Use that time really effectively and come up with a brick that you can use to concuss the closing half. Anyone like unconfident in being able to do that? Or want any tips? Or yep. Okay, so if you're trying to bring back material that hasn't been responded to, you can almost literally say, we told you this and it's important, now respond to it, please. If you're trying to actually rebuild it because you think the closing half has done significant damage to it, come up with a reason why their rebuttal wasn't always true is usually the easiest thing to do. So for instance, going to the Beavis example, one of his POIs, the debate's pretty complicated, but the POI was basically, well, you've said this, but it's only true in really rare and marginal cases. What about all of the other ones? And that's a good way of sort of bringing your material back and making it a bit stronger. Yeah? Answer? Yeah? Any other questions? Cool. Closing half. Oh, there's more. Oh, yes. So it's a common belief that if the other opening half screws up, it's really good for you because you'll dominate the opening half and therefore become relevant. It's actually not. You want the other opening team to be as strong as possible and to get as much of their case right as possible, because it means you're the team that gets to respond to it, and that the best part of the debate is happening in the opening half and not getting dragged to the closing. There's nothing worse for an opening gov team than when the opening opposition misses their case altogether and closing op just gets to run away with it. So I would suggest, don't explicitly give them their material, but make it really obvious to the other team what they need to be arguing, and then try and beat them at that. Don't let the closing team take all of that material, because then you can't respond to them and you can't be the one to deal with it. Yep?
I think it's worth burden pushing and your first speed on reaching opposition.
Well, burden pushing implies you're not proving your half of it first. You should get them to try and prove their side of it, but you should also prove your half of it. The point is that you don't want the other team, you want to beat the other team, but you don't want to mercilessly crush them because they've said nothing, because that's going to make it really hard for you to come first rather than second or third. Any other questions? Yeah.
If one more team try to set up a polls debate, does that mean that the other team might lose
Well, hopefully if they've both done it well, then their setup should be the same and the debate should be happening. If, what are you asking? Like, if...
I mean, if I sit there and then see how strong your opponent is setting up the debate, I just ignore that and try to come up with a construction.
No, you shouldn't ignore it, but you should come up with your own construction and then attack theirs. Or, like, setting up the debate shouldn't result in a lot of contradiction. If the debate is happening well, both teams will have the same definition and the same idea of what the teams need to prove. And then the debate is about the characterizations of the stakeholders or how the model will play out. And that's exactly what you want in the opening half. It means the real debate is happening, and closing half isn't going to be able to just run away with the debate. And I would say opening half victories, that's where both the opening opposition and the opening government get first and second, are probably the rarest result in debating. So it's really important that you try and make as much of the debate happen there as possible. Yep?
What's the significance of coming second or third, like in tournaments?
Oh, yeah, well, in tournaments. In practice debates, obviously doesn't mean that much, but like, as opposed to 3-on-3 where you just got a win or a loss, BP tournament you get between 3 and 0 points, depending on where you rank, and your ranking is determined by the total score of all of those. Yeah. So it's like important for tournaments, is basically all we take away from that. Yeah. Like I said, opening half wins are rare. But where they do happen, it's because the opening teams have had the real debate in the opening half and the closing teams have just like struggled to find anything to do. So, closing half. So, remember at the beginning when we said you basically had either a really broad extension or a really narrow extension. That should impact more than just the extension itself. The entire closing case should sort of work itself around that. So when the member is introducing the extension, if it's really narrow, they should be saying something like, the opening half focused really much on this. We're going to try and resolve that clash by bringing you this extension. And then when the whip summarises, they should try and frame the debate as, we all agreed that the debate was about this, but the resolution of that didn't come until we gave you our extension, and here's why, for like the content of their speech. Likewise, if it's a really broad debate, you want to do as little to acknowledge the opening half even existing as you possibly can. The member wants to say, yeah, the opening half had their little scuff about this, but what's really important is the effect our model will have on kittens, or whatever new prong of the extension we want to drive into. Yeah?
Back to the advertising there, where there are like several principal
Yep.
reasons we could deal with it. Say, like your closing government, opening government opens with principle 1 and you wanted to use principle 2. Do you still defend the first principle brought up? Like if you
Principle.
If you give differing like
I think if you're using principle, it's like a slang for case. So let's say Opening Gov wants to ban advertising because they don't like the fact that it perpetuates stereotypes about the attractive women or the nuclear family, etc. Closing Gov might decide we want to do as little with that as possible. We want to make the debate about the effect advertising has on capitalism. So one way that they could do that is probably say, Opening Op was really worried about the effect this was going to have on deterring people from buying things. Our extension is going to explain why it makes the system of economics greater. You never have to defend your opening government, necessarily. You have to defend the motion, but you don't have to defend everything that Opening Gov has said about the motion. And if they've run a completely different case to you, often it's better to just like let it die. The only difference is like letting your opening die versus rebutting the other side. And you obviously want to rebut the other side if it's also relevant to your extension. Yep?
One caveat I put that is if you are going to distance yourself from your opening, don't do what Beams did, which is to say, like in response to a POI, that was, oh, how do you defend what your opening government say? Respond indignantly, oh, I don't need to defend anything that my opening government said. I would have run much better cases if I was opening government. So if the opening government is terrible, that's fine. You just have to distance yourself by using appropriate language and not by just belligerently
also be going a little wild with the characterization of Beavis in that debate. It was more like he sort of marginalized the importance of what the opening half had said and tried to sneak away from it by doing something different. Yeah.
I think maybe the confusion is a little bit knifing, and someone please correct me if I'm wrong, is specifically rejecting the model offered by the opening. So it's if the opening says.
So it's if you.
Opening said,
So it's if you directly contradict your opening, right? If it's something you can say, well, they said this happened, but it won't definitely happen. This could also happen, and that isn't a direct contradiction because you've explained like how stakeholders behave. Then that's not really knifing. That's just trying to distance yourself. One thing I'll also throw in there is that there's this common myth that closing opposition teams are allowed to knife the opening opposition because they represent like a coalition opposition of different parties. That's absolutely not true, and I don't know where that belief has come from. It's also pretty stupid when you think about it, because we're not literally having a parliamentary debate here. It's just like a style mimicking it. So the same rules apply for both teams, and you're not allowed to knife. Yep.
If you're dealing with an op bench that has one of the teams has knifed the other, if it's been explicit, obviously don't waste too much time pointing it out. But if it's a subtle knifing which does create tension amongst the op bench, is it worth really pointing out in a lot of time?
Well, pointing out the tension only cripples one op team, right? Because
Or both, and how bad the tension is, or how close it is to a knife?
if it's a subtle knife, then by definition it's kind of legal and you don't get credit just for pointing it out. So you kind of have to find ways of using the tension to exploit the other side's case. So, for instance,
Would you try and use that to, like, do you try and, obviously, do you just try and use it against the team that's actually done subtle knifing? Or do you try
it goes back to whichever team you think is stronger. You want to focus as much attention on dealing with them as possible. So if opening op has been clearly dominating the case and closing op tries to knife them a little bit, but comes out nowhere near as strong, then you need to deal with opening op. I would probably focus on their version of events, and like do what you need to rebut closing op, but pretend that the opening op case is still the most important one and is like the truth. Yep. Any other questions about that? Yep.
Just sort of when it comes to agreement with teams, let's say take the sex in public POI for example.
Yep.
If you think that your POI has a lot of ammo and it's really good, is it worth spending? But you're not entirely sure they're going to understand the implication of it. Is it worth, like in a debate like that, to give some sort of context, like, oh, you said this about pornography? Would you then agree that you would have people have sex in public, all that sort of stuff?
Well, that's going to depend a lot on whether you actually want them to understand the purpose of the POI. You want them to understand the language of the POI and to be able to answer the question. The importance of it, them understanding the reason you're asking it isn't that important, and often you can get more out of it if they don't. But if you're explicitly asking them to defend something they'd previously said in the speech, then you probably need to say, you said this, blah, blah, blah. But that's an example of where if you were laying a trap, you wouldn't want them to understand the point. You'd want them to screw it up and give it the wrong answer so that you could exploit it later. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Sasha?
I think you thought it was really important, as long as you have others speak and your team's still up to speed, that they can then explain to each other where you were going with what the formula was, rather than you trying to do it in the POI. Like if you're like overlooking,
Yeah, that's definitely an influencing factor, yeah. But like, it depends, it really depends on whether you want them to respond to part of their own earlier speech and therefore you are giving it the context. If you just want them to give you, if the answer is more important than the reason for the question, then you're just asking the question and you want them to answer it stupidly. But obviously that depends very much on the specific POI and the specific debate. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Any other questions about, where were we up to? Yeah. So the whip speech. It's a little bit more complicated than a 3-on-3 third speech, because you need to try and focus attention on your extension rather than just summarising the debate? I think I'm getting the 3-minute warning. Okay. So 2 big things about whip. 1, don't explicitly make summary points about teams' cases. I've seen a whip speech which was first the closing op extension, then our extension, then issues from the opening half. Worst whip speech I've ever seen because it was in no way reflective of the actual debate. You want to try and figure out, you want to try and take the big key clash that the debate has been about and focus your whip speech on that and explaining why your extension won that. If that means that you exclude teams that have been made irrelevant, so be it. The second thing for whip is that you more than anyone else need to keep an accurate track of how important speakers' material has been and which teams are winning the debate, because when it comes to summarising the debate, you need to deal with that explicitly. So, as opposed to 3-on-3 where you might have just been tracking the arguments and which ones you need to respond to in order to win, in this you also need to take notes on how much time you should really devote to that based on how important it is. And if the opening op is clearly stronger than the closing op, and you're the gov whip, you pretty much just want to give the minimum response to closing op possible and then spend as much time shredding opening op as possible. It's also worth noting that since the gov whip is the only speaker that can respond to closing opposition, it's really helpful if the member has already given the necessary rebuttal to the opening op so that they can spend at least a full couple of minutes responding to the closing op case in their speech. Likewise, the closing opposition member has to bring out everything. Even if they don't do the full breadth of analysis, because they've only got 7 minutes, everything that team wants to address in their case has to come out in the opposition member, because no one can respond to the opposition whip. Which consequently means adjudicators give them very little weighting in the debate if they're talking about new things. So make sure that the opposition member at least brings out the headings of the rebuttal points and just a brief bit of detail, even if that means the whip is then going to go into much more detail in their own speech. I think I've still got another 10 minutes worth of stuff, but if we're going to run out of time, I can't really do that. So does anyone have any important questions that they'd like answered? They're really burning and you're worried will screw up the practice debate if you don't know what the answer is. Okay then. Yep.
Is there any way we should think about how to structure our prep time?
Well, the first thing is always figure out what the debate, what the motion's about and how broad it is, and that will frame a lot of how you set up your case. But it's all down to basically what's the most important material in the debate, how are we going to run it? And the only real difference is sort of opening teams just sort of explicitly think of that and run it in their speeches. Closing half teams think, well, what's the opening obviously going to get? What can we ignore? And how can we improve on that? Yeah. Sorry? I can, but the slides themselves are not all that much use. Yeah, that's just about... Yep. It's just about, that was basically just the stuff about how only the gov whip can respond to closing op and only closing op member can print stuff out.